Throughout their lives, these two 20th century American authors sought each other's feedback, but soon the effort grew one-sided as Fitzgerald realized he received nothing but harsh personal attacks from Ernest Hemingway. Both men's lives ended badly and much too soon. This is the story of Hemingway versus Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald, 3 years older than Hemingway, had gone to Princeton and was a member of one of America's oldest families. His relative and namesake, Francis Scott Key, wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, and there are bridges and parks named for him across America. In college, F. Scott Fitzgerald concentrated on writing musicals for the Triangle Club, failed his courses, and never graduated. World War I broke out, and Fitzgerald had no choice but to enlist. He did not see action, but poured his wartime memories and belief that he would live only 3 months due to the ongoing senseless slaughter of his brethren in Europe into his writing. In his early 20s, he achieved instant success with This Side of Paradise in 1920 and The Beautiful and the Damned in 1922. He led a glamorous life with his wife Zelda in New York City, but realized the superficiality of the moment and chose his hometown of St. Paul, Minnesota, for the birth of his only daughter, Scotty. He first met Hemingway in Paris in April 1925, 2 weeks after Gatsby was published and at the high point of his career. Hemingway immediately envied Fitzgerald's literary fame, material success, and luxurious way of life, a vivid contrast to his own obscurity and rather pinched existence. Fitzgerald went out of his way to help Hemingway. He introduced Hemingway to Scribner's publishers, despite the fact Fitzgerald's own publisher, Max Perkins, laid his career on the line for Fitzgerald and helped him towards recognition. Hemingway was similar to the jocks Fitzgerald had known at Princeton. It seems as if Fitzgerald dreamt Hemingway up. He was so similar to the heroine Daisy Buchanan's wife in The Great Gatsby. He had masculine strength, capacity for drink, athletic prowess, and experience on the battlefield as an ambulance driver, which Fitzgerald, with his non-combatant's shell shock, sadly lacked. 6 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier than Fitzgerald, Hemingway was a literary version of the bloodied football heroes Fitzgerald admired at Princeton and incorporated in The Great Gatsby. But Hemingway's masculinity was false. He endured shrapnel wounds from both legs due to a mortar blast on the Italian front. Yet despite the injuries to his legs, Hemingway insisted on walking around Paris with a head bandage. He did not need this head bandage, as it does not appear in Red Cross photographs from July 1918. Hemingway had a preference for the camera, insisting on taking photographs everywhere, from in the hospital to outside the hospital to Paris and on and on. Contrast this with Fitzgerald, despite reminiscences that he was a dazzling figure, didn't pose for photographs very often. The two authors led parallel but contrasting lives. Fitzgerald was born into a Midwestern Irish Catholic family in St. Paul, Minnesota, in 1896. His father came from tired old stock with very little left of vitality and mental energy. He did not succeed in the furniture store business or the soap business. However, he introduced Scott to books which he loved and remembered all his life. Fitzgerald's mother was strong and domineering. He had a delicate, almost feminine beauty. Some scholars argue he was physically frail. This is not necessarily the case. He loved swimming and spent summers swimming on the French Riviera. He married the gorgeous and wild Zelda in 1920 and moved to Paris to work on The Great Gatsby, set in Long Island and Manhattan or Bridgeport, Connecticut, depending on who you ask. Their daughter Scotty was born in 1921. Fitzgerald's style was romantic, lyrical, and lush. He had many friends and adored his fellow expatriate Gerald Murphy, the wealthy amateur painter who would become a model for Dick Diver in Tender is the Night in 1934. In contrast, Hemingway was born into a Midwestern Protestant family in Oak Park, a wealthy suburb of Chicago, in 1899. His father was a doctor and a great outdoorsman who was dominated by his wife, whom Hemingway hated and blamed for his father's suicide in 1928. Hemingway's hatred of his mother would spill into hatred of other women. After high school, Hemingway worked as a reporter in Kansas City and approached fiction through journalism. Handsome and physically powerful, he was a good skier, boxer, hunter, and fisherman, but he never attended college, unlike the Ivy League Fitzgerald. 3 years later, Hemingway married Hadley Richardson, a good hiker and notable contrast to the stunning artistic genius Zelda. Zelda helped introduce Southern blues and jazz to the French Riviera with her raucous parties at Hotel du Paris. Hemingway moved to Paris in 1922, worked as a correspondent for the Toronto Star, and covered international conferences and wars as far away as Constantinople, Turkey. He also began to publish with highbrow magazines and little presses. The Sun Also Rises, set in Paris and Spain, has a terse, compressed, and laconic style, and an attractive but drunken heroine. Hemingway was a heavy drinker, and where Fitzgerald idolized people like Gerald Murphy, Hemingway found him idle and superficial. Generous, helpful, and dreamy, cautious, and risk-averse, Fitzgerald led a glamorous life. By contrast, Hemingway was competitive, selfish, realistic, tough, short-tempered, and dangerous. He liked violent situations in sport and war, which tested his physical courage, took many risks, and suffered frequent injuries. He loved bullfights in Spain, learned Italian, French, Spanish, and German, while Fitzgerald stuck to English, lived in Cuba, and traveled in Africa and Asia. He was a big game hunter. Fitzgerald was not. Hemingway welcomed Hollywood by selling his novels to be made into movies, while Scott preferred to work by the value of his own hand and worked briefly as a screenwriter. After the great success of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms in 1929 and For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940, his work declined, but he continued his journalistic and politically liberal efforts and then won the Nobel Prize in 1954. Fitzgerald and Hemingway knew each other intimately and were extremely perceptive about one another's virtues and faults. Fitzgerald saw that Hemingway, oppressed by his mother's influence, was still rebelling against having been made to take cello lessons when growing up. Helping him leave Liverite Publishing for the more prestigious Scribner's, Fitzgerald took the role of an older sophisticate who guided his charming but naive Midwestern friend toward the promised land. Fitzgerald was also from the Midwest, and so I believe the two bonded over this. Fitzgerald told his editor, Max Perkins, to hear him talk, you'd think Liverite had broken up his home and robbed him of millions, but that's because he knows nothing of publishing, except in the Cuckoo magazines, is very young, and feels helpless so far away. You won't be able to help liking him. He's one of the nicest fellows I ever knew. Hemingway, who rarely praised contemporaries and rivals, called Great Gatsby an absolutely first-rate book. Fitzgerald's novel reveals a new and confident mastery of his material, a mysterious hero and idealized heroine, a complex plot with adultery, crime, murder, class conflicts, and incisive social satire, an opulent setting and lavish parties, a Keatsian ability to evoke a romantic atmosphere through prose, the loss of impossible dreams and illusions, the symbolism of America, and a silken style that seems as fresh today as it did almost a century ago. The imagery and sense of loss in The Great Gatsby influenced the conclusion of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. The narrator Nick Carraway says when he leaves Gatsby's mansion as Gatsby and Daisy seem to recapture but are really about to lose their dreams, Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. Hemingway boldly appropriated this and used it as the last sentence in A Farewell to Arms. After a while, I went out and left the hospital and walked back to the hotel in the rain. Fitzgerald, to our knowledge, never complained. Fitzgerald's journals were online for a while and you could read them. I'm not sure if they're online anymore for free. In his most artistically refined novel, The Great Gatsby, which Hemingway said inspired him to write his own novels, Fitzgerald contrasts Midwestern and East Coast values with Nick Carraway as the moral center and masculine polo player Tom Buchanan as Gatsby's rival. In later novel, The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway does the same thing. He contrasts American and expatriate values, with Jake Barnes as the unsteady moral center and the bullfighter Pedro Romero as his masculine rival. There is heavy drinking in both novels. During Prohibition in America, Gatsby is a bootlegger, and in the more bibulous France and Spain of The Sun Also Rises, Barnes tells Robert Cohn, who wants to travel to South America, you can't get away from yourself by moving from one place to another. In Gatsby, the characters move frantically from Long Island to Manhattan, and the fatal car accident takes place between the two. In The Sun Also Rises, Barnes shifts uneasily from Paris to Spain to see the running of the bulls in Pamplona, fish in the Pyrenees, swim in San Sebastian, and rescue Brett in Madrid. In both novels, the heroes of the lost generation face formidable problems. Gatsby has lower-class origins, knows degrading poverty, criminal activities, has fantastic dreams, and futile gestures. He's exposed and victimized by Tom Buchanan and murdered by Wilson, who mistakenly thinks that Gatsby, not Daisy, has killed his wife Myrtle in a car accident. Hemingway's Barnes has suffered a war wound that made him impotent, leads a decadent life, and is hopelessly in love with Brett Ashley. Brett's great love has been killed in World War I. She's had a bad marriage to a shell-shocked husband, is an alcoholic and nymphomaniac, and has a disastrous affair with Pedro Romero. Both Gatsby and Barnes are in love with an unworthy and unattainable woman who are symbolic of something greater than themselves, and the novels end with shattered illusions. Brett, built with curves like the hull of a racing yacht, seems to be the inverse of Fitzgerald's Daisy. Hemingway makes her substantive, intense, while Daisy remains symbolic and vague. When walking down Fifth Avenue in New York together, Fitzgerald tells Hemingway, almost verbatim, if only I could play football again with everything I know about it now. Forgetting the source, Hemingway quoted this as a typically foolish remark in his books. But in Across the River and Into the Trees, the failed hero Richard Cantwell quite seriously thinks the very same thing about war. I wish I could fight it again, knowing what I know now. Hemingway admired Fitzgerald in the mid-1920s, but became more critical as he knew him better in the late 1920s and cruelly attacked him in the 1930s. The first fissure in their friendship occurred early on when Fitzgerald advised him to cut the first 2 chapters of The Sun Also Rises, which described the background of the characters and afforded a more leisurely approach to the novel. Though editor Max Perkins wanted to keep them, Hemingway cut them and later resented his submission to Fitzgerald's judgment. The first chapter now begins with a misleading emphasis on the odious Robert Cohn, who seems to be the main character but is actually much less important than Jake Barnes and Brett Ashley. A more volatile incident, which Hemingway never forgave, took place in June 1929, when Fitzgerald lost track of the time in Hemingway's boxing match with Canadian writer Morley Callahan. After Callahan knocked Hemingway down, Fitzgerald woke up and screamed, "Oh my God, I let the round go 4 minutes." "All right, Scott," Ernest said savagely, "if you want to see me getting the shit knocked out of me, just say so. Only don't say you made a mistake." "He thinks I did it on purpose. Why would I do it on purpose?" Fitzgerald asked innocently. Fitzgerald remained faithful to Zelda during her breakdowns and supported his family as a good man would do. Hemingway never understood this and insisted Zelda should have been divorced when she was still attractive enough to entice other men, and told Fitzgerald this. Hemingway discarded 3 wives and gave the 4th one a rough time. He exposed his children to his extramarital affairs when they were very young. His first wife, Hadley, had nothing on Zelda's artistic and social ability, which would have been obvious to Hemingway and others at the French literary parties the couples attended in the 1920s. Fitzgerald truly prophesied that Hemingway needed the emotional anguish of a divorce and the excitement of a new wife to create a major work. He told Callahan, "I have a theory that Ernest needs a new woman for each big book. There was one for the stories, and The Sun Also Rises. Now there's Pauline. A Farewell to Arms is a big book. If there's another big book, I think we'll find Ernest has another wife." Sure enough, Martha Gellhorn, his companion in the Spanish Civil War, became Hemingway's third wife when he was writing For Whom the Bell Tolls. Fitzgerald obliquely alludes to Hemingway in his sad self-exposure and evisceration in The Crack-Up, a 3-part essay that appeared in Esquire magazine in February, March, and April 1936. This public catharsis, when he was blocked as a writer, confirmed Hemingway's criticism of Fitzgerald's weaknesses and was more severe than anything Hemingway ever wrote about him. Fitzgerald wanted to hurt himself first before a buffoon like Hemingway could. Maybe Fitzgerald could see that Hemingway was coming for him, that he had become a literary target on one of Hemingway's favorite big game hunts. Like Hemingway, Fitzgerald believes that life was something you dominated if you were any good. But Fitzgerald lent a natural aristocracy and noblesse oblige to this mentality. Hemingway simply believed might made right. In The Crack-Up, Fitzgerald gets very personal with the reader and admits that life has dominated him and he's cracked up. Contrasting his tame military service to Hemingway's war wounds, which Hemingway emphasized, he foolishly equates two very different tests of manhood: not being big enough or good enough to play football in college and not getting overseas during the war. In a letter to Perkins, Fitzgerald contrasted his own laborious writing to Hemingway's deceptively effortless ease. "Everything I have ever attained has been through long and persistent struggle, while it is Ernest who has a touch of genius that enables him to bring off extraordinary things with facility." He confessed he'd always wanted to have a nourishing connection to Hemingway, had always longed to absorb into himself some of the qualities that made Ernest attractive, and to lean on him like a sturdy crutch in times of psychological distress. His last wish, however, was never granted, and he always got more abuse than comfort from his caustic friend. In 1936, he admitted he could never face Hemingway after their positions had been disastrously reversed. "I talk with the authority of failure, Ernest with the authority of success. We could never sit across the table again." Yet in another tragic prophecy, he saw himself and his friends as two sides of the same manic-depressive personality. "He is quite as nervously broken down as I am, but it manifests itself in different ways. His inclination is toward megalomania, and mine is towards melancholy." The subtlety of Scott's masculinity, reliable, romantic, intense, was totally lost on Hemingway and on the American public for decades. Hemingway encouraged Fitzgerald to look down on servants, including Irish servants, despite knowing Fitzgerald had a lot of Irish blood. In A Movable Feast, Hemingway even criticized Fitzgerald's attractive but effeminate appearance. "He looked like a boy with a face between handsome and pretty. He had a delicate, long-lipped Irish mouth that on a girl would have been the mouth of a beauty. The mouth worried you until you knew him, and then it worried you more, because it suggested a kind of androgynous decadence. One could argue this is Hemingway losing control at the end of his life, totally consumed by lust that didn't last 4 marriages." Satirizing Fitzgerald's hermetic, rich, faithful, snobbish, and alcoholic milieu, he wrote that his idea of heaven was a beautiful vacuum filled with wealthy monogamists, all powerful, and members of the best families all drinking themselves to death. Hemingway despised Fitzgerald's worship of youth, sexual naivete, innocence, self-pity, attraction to money, and lack of dedication to his art. His worst qualities were his inability to hold his liquor. Putting the knife in, he said Fitzgerald never achieved maturity and jumped straight from youth to senility without going through manhood. Hemingway completely neglected the decades of effort Fitzgerald put in to keep his wife and daughter safe and happy in Alabama, Switzerland, France, and elsewhere, Even as Zelda struggled with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, he ensured his daughter had enough money for horseback riding lessons, and by all accounts, Scotty became a superb rider. Hemingway bluntly told Fitzgerald that his egotistic self-absorption prevented him from getting valuable material, and advised him to pay attention to people and learn from what they said, in a time when Fitzgerald just needed a friend. A long time ago, you stopped listening except to the answers to your own questions. That is where it all comes from. Seeing, listening. You see well enough, but you stop listening. No friend did more for Hemingway than Fitzgerald. Apart from placing him with Scribners, he gave him money when he needed it, lent the family his Riviera villa when their little son John was sick, and personally rushed from Delaware to the Philadelphia train station when Hemingway suddenly needed cash to get to Chicago after his father's suicide. But Hemingway, who valued his independence and disliked obligations, quarreled with friends who helped him and was consumed by jealousy of bigger men. There's a striking contrast between telling Fitzgerald in 1927, "I get maudlin about how damned swell you are the best damn friend I have," and the end of something 2 years later when his drunken best friend was out of control. In a murderous letter, Hemingway told Perkins, "Last time Scott was in Paris, he got us kicked out of one apartment and in trouble all the time, insulted the landlord, peed on the front porch, tried to break down the door at 3, 4, and 5 a.m. I am very fond of Scott, but I'll beat him up before I'll let him come and get us ousted from this place. As a matter of fact, I'm afraid I'd kill him." More empty bravado from Hemingway. The Stoic, whose motto was "Il faut durer," condemned Fitzgerald's pitiful self-exposure in the crack-up and told Perkins, "He seems to almost take a pride in his shamelessness of defeat. He had a marvelous talent, and the thing is to use it, not whine in public." This whining in public was actually a remarkable form of self-expression, the author as man that others could see inside and relate to. Hemingway felt that Fitzgerald's self-autopsy and premature funeral sermon gave him the right to publicly criticize him in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, which appeared in the same magazine, Esquire, in August 1936, only 3 months after Fitzgerald's essays. In The Snows of Kilimanjaro, Harry, the failed writer, bitterly thinks, "He remembered poor Scott Fitzgerald and his romantic awe of the rich. He thought they were a special glamorous race, and when he found out they weren't, it wrecked him, just as much as any other thing that wrecked him." Hemingway knew that self-destructive Fitzgerald had not been wrecked by the rich. Hemingway did not hesitate to name Scott by name in this international piece. Fitzgerald was especially vulnerable because 1936 was the year Zelda became insane. He was so disturbed by this story that he attempted suicide but vomited from an overdose of morphine, an episode that to Hemingway proved not only his weakness but also Hemingway's power to wound. Hemingway was bolstered by this and attempted greater and greater literary achievements afterwards. Though Hemingway changed Fitzgerald's name to Julian when the story appeared in a book, the damage was done. Hemingway did not attend Fitzgerald's funeral in 1940. Hemingway's posthumous time bomb, A Movable Feast, cruelly retaliated for Fitzgerald's extraordinary generosity and kindness, even though the man was dead. He portrayed Fitzgerald as rude to all foreigners, childish, gauche, wasteful, irresponsible, quarrelsome, irritating, an artistic whore and a destroyer of his own talent. Completely unreliable, he misses the train to take him and Hemingway to retrieve his automobile in Lyon, and does not have a top on his car to protect them from the rain. The horror, you would think a masculine man like Hemingway could stand a little rain. A ludicrous and self-indulgent hypochondriac, he interferes with Hemingway's writing and, improbably, humiliates himself by asking Hemingway to a dick measuring contest. As Zelda became increasingly frigid, according to Hemingway, she attacked his sexual capacity and made him doubt his ability to satisfy her. This is Hemingway at his most insane. The attacks on Zelda versus Scott have only increased in recent years, which raise questions on who in the Hemingway camp continues to stoke these rumors. I've read the ongoing myth is that Scott stole all of his stories from Zelda, which is false, especially since Zelda was writing her own work. Many of her manuscripts remain lost, and it would be great if we could find them. We know they're out there somewhere. And they spent months apart from one another as Zelda descended into bipolar and schizophrenia care in Switzerland and Maryland. The sexually exciting, artistic, socially adept Southern woman Zelda was Hemingway's bête noire, and he told Fitzgerald with his usual sensitivity and tact, "I thought Zelda was crazy the first time I met her, and you complicated it even more by being in love with her." He blamed Zelda for trying to destroy her husband and wrote to Perkins, "I think 90% of all the trouble he has comes from her." Hemingway preferred women who were not as dynamic and seemed to miss the point. Up until his death, Zelda wrote some of the most beautiful letters in the English language, captured in the book Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda, which I recommend everyone read. It's so good. The silence in the letters after Scott dies is completely tragic. Did she know her beloved Dodo was dead? In contrast, Hemingway's wives couldn't have cared less. Hemingway actually called his first wife Hadley the night before he shot himself, and she didn't even care to call him back. As usual, Hemingway's brute force lost the plot. In A Movable Feast, Hemingway wanted to barb Zelda too. He wrote that Zelda was jealous of Scott's work. As soon as he was working well, Zelda would begin complaining about how bored she was and get him off on another drunken party. Most grievously, he said Fitzgerald allowed Zelda to cuckold him with a dashing French aviator, Edouard Jossin, which we still don't know is true or not. Hemingway wasn't done being cruel and satirized Zelda, a model for Margot Macomber, in his story The Short Happy Life of Frances Macomber, whose hero has the same name as Francis Scott Fitzgerald. Like Zelda, Margot is a great beauty, but has a nasty character. I don't think Zelda had a nasty character, so I don't agree. The White Hunter, experienced with wealthy female clients, calls her the kind of woman the hardest in the world, the hardest, the cruelest, the most predatory, and the most attractive, and their men have softened or gone to pieces nervously as they have hardened. In a bitter exchange, after Macomber discovers her adultery, he feebly complains about her past and present behavior, and she mocks him with cutting endearments. "You think that I'll take anything. I know you will, sweet. There wasn't going to be any of that. You promised there wouldn't be." "Well, there is now," she said sweetly. Let's compare this supposed great piece of exciting, emotional Hemingway prose to just a snippet of Fitzgerald. Men and girls came and went, like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. There is more emotion in that little snippet than Hemingway's climax. Or this from Fitzgerald's work Presumption. "You loved me the other day. You wanted me to sit beside you in the dark. Didn't I feel it? Didn't I know? There's something between us, a sort of pull, something you always do to me, and I to you." At the end of his life, Hemingway had fulfilled Fitzgerald's prophecies and became tragically like his old friend. He too had been dazzled by the rich, turned into a celebrity, and encouraged his offspring to be celebrities. His family, including Muriel Hemingway, continued to seek the limelight. He was blocked as a writer, had failed in marriage, escaped into alcoholism, and cracked up. Ill-equipped to deal with depression, he put a shotgun in his mouth and killed himself. Today, the house where Scott and Zelda lived in Alabama is well-maintained and beloved. Visitors can walk through Zelda's garden and see the love this couple had for one another. I visited this place, and these are my photos, and I absolutely loved it. You can spot the little theater where Zelda considered putting on plays, while Scott was away writing in Hollywood. The feeling of community around these buildings cannot be met in some foreign bullfight or animal carcass dragged from Africa by Hemingway. The search engines are also clear. A search for F. Scott Fitzgerald reveals 47 million articles, pictures, and links, while Hemingway only inspires 28 million.